While the very first Impressionist exhibition in 1874 is met with scorn and criticized quite publicly, by the time we get to the 1880s and the 1890s, Impressionism has become a very popular style of painting. And while an artist like Claude Monet is certainly experimenting with color and light and building towards abstraction, other artists who are part of this group take a more traditional approach to painting. So, for example, I'm showing you the work of Gustave Caillebotte here on the left. It's a work that's called Paris, A Rainy Day, and as you can see, he uses this very tight brushwork. It's almost photographic in the way that it's rendered, and some of the critics who had come to like Impressionism and its loose brushwork decided that this was considered kind of bourgeois and old-fashioned. Nonetheless, what's very important about Gustave Caillebotte is that he gives us this interesting picture of Haussmann's Paris. So really what late 19th century Paris looks like as it's been transformed. This is one of those buildings like I showed you in the background of Monet's train station. And here's an actual photograph of how this building looks today. So yes, you can still travel to Paris and see this exact location. It's no longer cobblestone, as you can tell. But the idea was that Haussmann built these broad avenues that people could walk and they would window shop, and that would create a kind of urban life and culture where people interacted with one another. One other important thing about Gustave Caillebotte is that he was independently wealthy, and so he was instrumental in purchasing a lot of early works from his Impressionist friends, which were then ultimately donated to France and today are in their national collections. So although he's a little bit different than what we traditionally think of as Impressionists, he's still part of this group because remember, there was no jury. As long as you were a member, you could show with the Impressionists. Auguste Renoir is also part of the Impressionist group, although he is academically trained, and so his early works are mostly classical subjects, and then that fades in the 1870s when he's kind of increasingly under the influence of his good friend Claude Monet and his experiments, and he begins painting contemporary life. So here at the Moulin de la Galette, I'm showing you a very popular dance hall that was in the neighborhood of Montmartre in Paris, which was made quite popular by a working class clientele, but what Renoir does is he replaces these people with his friends. So here they are, kind of the upper middle class, out enjoying one another. He's really interested in human life and people's relationships to one another, and you can see this camaraderie and the friendship. You can also see some of his academic background. If you look at this grouping of figures, see how this makes a kind of triangle that leads your eye through the picture? That is a convention that artists are trained to do in the academy. So you can see that background, but yet the dappled light here, where the light kind of comes through the trees and we see these shadows, certainly shows that Impressionist influence and all of those ideas coming from Monet. One of the interesting things that Renoir said is that for me, a picture should be a pleasant thing, joyful and pretty, yes, pretty. There are quite enough unpleasant things in life without the need for us to manufacture more. What's also interesting about him is that he feared that this style of Impressionist painting that depicted contemporary life wouldn't have kind of a lasting impact on the history of art. And so he decided towards the end of his career to go back to the subject matter of nudes because he figured the timelessness of a nude figure is like those Renaissance masters. Little did he know that Impressionism would still become one of the most popular art forms today. Edgar Degas is also an artist who shows with the Impressionists, but he disliked being called an Impressionist and preferred either realist or independent. He also painted popular Parisian subjects, amusements, the music hall, the opera, the ballet, as you see here, and also the circus. But he shows the influence of both photography as well as Japanese art. So notice how, for example, this ballerina's face is cut in half, almost like a photograph would be. Notice how the floor is kind of tipped up in the back and it's steep and it's not a traditional perspective. that's an idea that's borrowed from Japanese art. So there is something that we refer to as Japanisme, which emerges in the 19th century as a result of the fact that the Americans opened up trade forcibly with Japan beginning in 1853. And so after 1853, prior to that, Japan had been cut off from the West. We knew very little about Japanese culture, Japanese art. And all of a sudden, when the floodgates opened in 1853, Europeans as well as Americans are fascinated by art and architecture and design and artifacts and all kinds of things that are coming from Japan. For artists, this interest in patterns, the juxtaposition of patterns, a kind of lack of attention to perspective seemed to them kind of liberating, since in the West, since the Renaissance, it had been all about perspective and storytelling. And Japanese art created an alternative to that many of these Impressionists and other late 19th century artists will embrace. So I'm showing you these two side by side, Degas' ballet rehearsals, so you can see what I mean by the awkward perspective here. The other thing that's interesting about Degas is that his scenes, whether they're ballerinas or other subjects, are always kind of trying to capture that unguarded moment. So, for example, when he gives us a nude, which he calls the tub. So this is how someone would bathe in the 19th century. You have a basin, you have a pitcher with water. These are her hair extensions, her brush. She pours water over herself and then she sponges off. But it's a very awkward pose. It's not a traditional nude that's there for us to enjoy and to be put on display. And so one of the things that Degas says that I think is very telling about his perspective on people and on art is this. He says, quote, "Hitherto, the nude has always been represented in poses which presuppose an audience, but these women of mine are honest and simple folk, unconcerned by any other interest than those involved in their physical condition. It's as if you looked through a keyhole." And that's exactly it. It's as though you're a voyeur. You've just peeked into this woman. She's not aware of the fact that we're looking at her. And really the same is true of the ballerinas. This isn't the performance. This isn't the stage where the curtain has just gone up. But this is the rehearsal. This young woman here is not aware of us looking at her. She's in this very awkward pose. So Degas is kind of fascinated with that moment. Now, the subject matter of women bathing is one that we will see a number of Impressionists address. And so I'm showing you the work here of Berthe Morisot, who is one of just 4 women who had the notable distinction of showing with the Impressionists. She first established herself as an artist showing at the Salon of 1864, where she exhibited 2 landscape paintings to much acclaim. And then she became friends with the realist painter Edward Manet, later marrying his brother, and that's how she came into the art world and became part of the Impressionist group. Nonetheless, the critics always use terms like, quote, feminine charm and delicacy to describe the works that she paints. So here we have a woman at her toilette, but we see her from the back. There's a mirror here, so we've got this interesting reflection. And it's not the awkwardness of Degas, but it's almost as though we stand behind her, ready to assist, as though we're going to help her do her hair. This patterning shows a little bit of that interest in Japanese art. The interesting angles also may come from Japanisme. And of course, you can see the light flickering brushwork, which is so typical of the Impressionist